All right, let's move on to the just kind of a brief cultural history of Japan, focusing on its socio-economy. The way the film introduced Japanese anxiety was through was by illustrating first that Japan is an island off the coast of Asia.
It's to the sea the Japanese owe their privacy. Here the landscape has shaped the character of the people. With the sea a barrier preventing invasion, Japan has been allowed to develop in relative isolation.
It's an island with not a great many natural resources, and indeed it lives with volcanoes and earthquakes, and it has not a great deal of arable land. So historically, we have, or the argument is that this provides a condition for a certain anxiety about long-term stability. The cultural history of Japan is a history of a cultural seclusion. Do you know where Japan is? Beside what does Japan sit? More than likely, you will say China. And indeed, yes, we have China over here. But now where, relative to Japan and China, is, let's say, Korea? Is Korea down here? Is Korea up here? Korea is here, right in between. Take a look at the Korean peninsula. Southern part of the Korean peninsula sits right beside Japan in a way that Florida and Cuba are close together. This is important. Over a period of many centuries, China has been the dominant civilization. You hear about the dynasties of China, for example, and the long-term struggles to kind of organize China. China served as a major source of cultural influence through Korea to Japan. Japan at the bottom, Japan at the end, Japan having the lowest status. So if you want to think about relations among Japan, Korea, and China, begin with an image of flows of cultural influence coming from China through Korea to Japan. For example, over a period of centuries, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, a visit from a Korean king, a Korean emperor, let's say, to Japan was a really big event. A visit from Japan to Korea was not. So we have a history of seclusion in the Japanese context. Now, how is this country then organized? Because the image today is of this tremendously coherent organization. It was not for centuries. From the 1600s, from a period 1603 to 1854, Japan was ruled by what was called the Tokugawa Shogunate. Tokugawa Shogunate, which involved managing a military balance between the shogun as an imperial military leader, and daimyo, D-A-I-M-Y-O, daimyo, which are feudal regional military leaders. So there was a balance kind of struck between a feudal organization of local military systems in relationship to the overall leadership of the shogun. But the shogun wasn't a centralized leader in the same sense as you might think of a monarch. So we had, in other words, a secluded country, a secluded area, divided up into a kind of feudal system. At least the word feudal is the way the Europeans tended to look at it. Furthermore, it's a country that is separated by classes, 4 major classes. The samurai, which we know about as basically the warrior class, and the daimyo leadership consisting of samurai, leading peasantry, and then with other classes of artisans and merchants living in the interstices, or living amidst the class of the samurai and the peasants. Remember that hierarchy characterizes Japanese society. So as you think through then a period of some centuries coming up into the 19th century, picture a secluded island with relatively low status compared to China and indeed to Korea. Not terribly, or not organized terribly coherently because of this tension and balance between separate regional military leaders and a national leadership. Transformed suddenly. Now, during this period, European colonialists were in the region, especially Dutch, but the Dutch never participated significantly on the Japanese island. In 1854, you may know about this from textbooks, Admiral Perry arrives in Japan, bringing a colonial power into the Japanese, it's into the middle of Japan for the first time. This marks the beginning of a dramatic transformation in Japan that involves a restoration of a monarchy in the form of an emperor called the Meiji Restoration, and the beginnings of what has become a modern Japan. What enabled Japan to coalesce, what enabled Japan to come together into a more coherent organization was its fear of colonialism, marked by the presence of Admiral Perry. Indeed, what mobilized support for a return to an emperor, for a return to a centralized control, was a slogan that went as follows, quote, "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." In other words, revering the emperor, restoring a monarchy, was seen as a vehicle for a means for expelling the barbarians. What brought Japan together was its experience of colonialism. So, Japanese, under leadership of a monarchy, make a commitment to modernization. Why do they make a commitment to modernization? Because they realize, this is now 1854, the tremendous industrial power developing in the West. They needed and wanted to get a piece of that, and so they begin to look to the West and send out emissaries to the West to identify strategies that could be incorporated into a Japanese context. And the Japanese do this for another 100 years. Indeed, when I was a kid living in Pittsburgh, I watched the transformation take place there that I didn't understand until much later. Pittsburgh was a center for steel production. And all along the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers were piles of scrap metal. Huge piles of scrap metal. I used to drive alongside huge piles of scrap metal and did this for years. Slowly, these piles disappeared. Now, at the time, I thought it was because of some sort of new commitment to environmental control, maybe Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act or something like that was influencing this. What was going on was the Japanese were buying all this stuff. They were buying it, shipping it to Japan, and then reprocessing it into new products and then selling them back to the United States. So we have a case, that's one just small example of the Japanese looking to the West for ideas to incorporate into a Japanese context, and this the film addressed pretty explicitly. As a means for organizing more explicitly, the Japanese instituted a constitutional monarchy of the sort experienced, developed in Europe. And with a whole new kind of leadership, a business leadership. Now, who do you suppose became the business leaders? Given the traditional class structure with samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. So the merchants, the artisans, peasants, are these going to be the source of new leadership? Under what grounds would we have households that could organize? It was the samurai who became the new business leadership for Japan.
Starting out with a samurai spirituality. Samurais, they worked for their masters and they would die for their masters. If somebody insults your master, then you go kill the person who insulted your master and you kill yourselves. You could do that. And those people turned into businessmen after the Meiji Restoration, which happened in 1868. right after an American ship came over to Japan and forced Japan to open its borders to foreign trade. The samurais had to cut off their ponytails and put down their swords. In essence, they lost their jobs. They lost their jobs working for their masters or their regional territory. So what they did was they turned into their regional territory into a commercial center, and they devoted themselves in commerce. And some of them turned into a well-known zaibatsus, whose names are well known as Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and so forth, whom after the war actually was renamed as Keiretsu. During the World War II, the Japanese soldiers were ready to, or I might say forced to, fight and die for their countries. Soldiers got on planes which only had fuel for one way, and they would crash into an American battleship, and they die. And after World War II ended, those soldiers turned into workers who were now devoted to rebuilding their country, catching up to other industrialized countries, and then exceed. So I think part of this groupness and devotion are actually running in the culture in Japan.